Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I'm excited to share some thoughts on this book by Hugh Ross. It's called Why the Universe is the Way It Is. I have been reading a lot on the doctrine of creation, different interpretations of Genesis 1, and if you're familiar with some of the questions that come up with that subject, you may have heard of the name of Hugh Ross. So Hugh Ross is a astrophysicist, an astronomer who started a group called Reasons to Believe, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago, something like that. And this is a group that argues for old Earth creationism, specifically advocating for something called the day age view of Genesis 1. I've just thrown a couple of terms there that may or may not be familiar to you, but I talked in my last review video about the study committee reports that both the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, my denomination, and the PCA, the Presbyterian Church in America, did about 20, 25 years ago, going through various views. And one of the views that both of those reports, both those denominations, have generally accepted as being a possible interpretation of Genesis 1 is something called the day age view, which is telling us basically that it's arguing that Genesis 1, the 6 days of creation in Genesis 1, are laying out a historical account of God's creative work, and it's telling us the order in which God created various things. But a day age view would say that the word there for day is not being used in a literal 24-hour way, but is being used as it is sometimes elsewhere in Scripture to refer to long periods of time. And so that's often used to map onto what mainstream scientists argue that we see from the natural world, whether it's the geological column or ice cores or tree rings or measuring starlight. There's all different metrics depending on which field of science that you're involved in. But mainstream scientists look at these things and say, okay, we think the Earth is, the universe is 13.73 billion years old or whatever. We think the Earth is 4.5, 4.8 billion years old. We think, vegetation and tree, plant life came on the scene this many billions of years ago, and kind of on down through the line. And so a day age view is arguing that Genesis 1 leaves things open for that. And what Hugh Ross tries to do in a lot of his works is to try and argue for the reliability of Scripture based on what he sees in the realm of science and how he sees these things as fitting together. So many of you are probably familiar with young earth creation ministries like Creation Ministries International or Answers in Genesis. And they're kind of creation apologetics groups. So they're talking about these questions of Genesis 1 and science, but they're also doing so with an eye towards unbelievers and trying to use this to both disciple people within the church and evangelize people outside of the church. That's kind of the project they're engaged in. Hugh Ross is doing something similar, but from an old earth day age vantage point. And his group, Reasons to Believe, is probably the most well-known group that's trying to do that. So as I'm taking on this project of trying to read more about these different views and trying to really kind of go to the primary sources, get people telling me, their own view, not just recounting other people's view of things, I knew that Hugh Ross was a name that I wanted to read more about. And as I looked around online, this was a book that I saw recommended as like a good place to start. And so I read this book recently, and it was not at all what I thought it was going to be, and in some ways was not what I was looking for. But it's an interesting book. So let me tell you what I thought I was going to get, what I actually got, and then sort of my final thoughts. So what I thought I was going to get, I thought this was going to be his book where he would go through his exegesis of Genesis and lay out why he holds to a day age view and answer some of the questions that come up with that. There's linguistic questions about how you translate the Hebrew here. There's theological questions about how you understand death before the fall, and is that a problem, and where do you draw the line with death, and how do you call God's creation good if it involves suffering or death, those kinds of things. And I thought he would deal a lot with those questions, and also with laying out kind of what he sees in the science that makes him hold to an old earth. So I thought it was going to be very much a kind of biblical and scientific argument for an old earth and a day age interpretation. And that's not exactly what this book is doing. He has done that in other books. I've kind of come to find out he has a book where he deals with really the scriptural evidence. He's got books where he deals with more of the scientific evidence. This book is something else. This book is really an apologetics book. It's really, in some ways, almost an evangelistic book. It's written sort of with an unbeliever in mind, in some ways, and it's simply assuming an old earth view of things. So he points to different lines of evidence along the way. So it's not that he gives no reason for holding to an old earth, but this is not the place to sort of where he develops, hey, here's the reason scientifically why I'm convinced of what the mainstream science holds to, which is that the earth is very old. He simply assumes that that's the case, but then he talks about how the universe functions. And again, he's an astronomer, he's an astrophysicist, so he's thinking in those terms. A lot of his examples have to do with things outside of our planet, but he's looking at the universe and showing how amazingly complex things are, how involved things are, how interconnected things are, and how the creation seems to have been made in such a way that it's perfectly fitted for human life, for advanced human civilization, and for God's work of redemption to carry out. And so it starts off, the first, 7, 8, 9 chapters are very much science-based. He alludes to God here and there, he alludes to creation, but he's really just sort of walking you through how is the universe set up and how does it function. And what he shows is kind of the amazingness of the universe. So there's a lot of sort of intelligent design arguments that would be, I think, welcomed by Christians of all stripes, whether you're a young earth person or an old earth person or whatever. And so he walks through a lot of that, and he has a good way of explaining things. He is a scientist, he has a PhD in these things, he's done real work in the field, but he's also a very good communicator, and he kind of uses the running illustration of a car throughout each chapter to sort of develop his idea, which is kind of a fun pedagogical tool that he uses. But after developing sort of how the world works, he then turns to the biblical story and shows us how the Bible talks about God's purpose in the universe, man's place in that purpose and plan. He even works ahead to the new heavens and new earth, the creation to come, and basically makes the argument, what we see in the natural world fits with what we see in the Bible, and the age of the earth, the distribution of the planets and stars, the laws that God has put in place, all of these things are exactly what they would need to be for humanity to play the part that God has written for us in his story. And so he uses that kind of line of argument to basically present a case for the gospel. And he kind of ends with like a gospel call and, here's how you become a Christian kind of thing. And so, like I said, it was not the book that I thought I was picking up, and in some ways not the book I was looking for, because he assumes in this book what I was hoping he would prove. And I think he tries to prove it in other books, but I have to wait to get that argument. So how do I assess this book? Well, at this point, my understanding, I tend towards a young earth creation perspective. So I'm not convinced of an old earth. I understand some of the arguments for it. I respect a day-age view. Some of my theological heroes have held to a day-age view, like J. Gresham Machen and others. But it's not, it's not the view I hold currently, and it's not of the competing models that are out there. It's not the one that's most compelling to me for a variety of reasons. But I think what this book did well was to sort of step inside the mind of an old earth creationist, of someone who holds to a day-age view, and to helpfully demonstrate how their belief in an old earth is not something that has to sort of stand in tension with the biblical story necessarily, but how it can actually integrate with and augment the biblical story in some interesting ways. He shows how accepting the mainstream view of the age of the earth and some of those questions could actually be something that actually gives more ammunition for our evangelism, our apologetics, our discipleship. Again, I am not yet convinced. I haven't yet walked through and seen the arguments exegetically and scientifically for why I should hold to an old earth, so I'm not there. But it's helpful to know, if someone was there, that doesn't have to be a step away from the integrity of the text or the compellingness of the gospel story. I think I've often sort of looked at old earth advocates and said, okay, like even if that was true, it just seems weird that God would start creation 13.7 billion years ago and then wait until, thousands of years ago to have humanity be created. and the human story unfold. Like, why wait all that time? Why waste all that time? And I think what Ross does a good job of showing is, if God did initiate creation billions of years ago, and if he did allow creation to unfold under normal conditions, then actually the timeline that we seem to see in the physical record maps on exactly to what it would have to be. Okay, so again, I'm not saying that I agree with his interpretive framework for things, but it's always good to kind of just charitably say, okay, can I put myself in my brother or sister's shoes? Can I understand how they're approaching this question, and can I see what strengths and weaknesses it has? So from that vantage point, it was a very pleasurable read, and I think if you do hold to an old Earth, or you're talking with someone who is convinced of sort of the an old Earth, and maybe they even say, "Oh, Christianity can't be true. The Bible doesn't make sense because it's a book that was written in the ancient Near East a few thousand years ago, and we now know so much more about the cosmos, and the cosmos is billions of years old, and so that's all irrelevant." This would be a book that would sort of meet them on their own terms and say, "Hey, even if we assume what you are assuming, what you believe about the world, about reality, look at look at the implications of that, and look at how it connects to the biblical story." So, because I'm not an old Earth guy, I don't think this is a book that I would hand to someone. But if you're in that circle or talking to someone in that space, this is a good book, and Hugh Ross is a good writer, and I think he does a good job of trying to make some of the main things the main things. Again, he's not so much arguing for his views. He doesn't engage in critique of young Earth views or framework view or analogical view or anything else. So it's not quite dealing with the subjects that I'm have on my mind at the moment, but it was an interesting read, an introduction to his writing, and I hope to read some of his other books, which will get more into the questions that I have in view. In fact, just to kind of preview what I have coming up as I'm thinking through this topic, I've sort of identified, the four main options, interpretive options that tend to be present in my circles are, a literal 24-hour calendar day view, a day age view, the analogical view, and the framework view. And those are views that I want to read some of the best books that I can from each of those positions. And so I've identified at least one book for each of those positions that's laying out, here's the view, here's the argument biblically, to some extent scientifically perhaps as well. And I want to read through those, and I'll give my thoughts as I do that. So that's kind of where I'm going. This book doesn't quite fit into that, but it was a fun and helpful read nonetheless. And if you're interested in these issues, it could be worth looking into. Why the Universe is the Way It Is by Hugh Ross.